welcome to this AGU Pathfinder webinar, Professional Etiquette Do's and Don'ts, featuring Patricia Simpson. My name is Leslie Marasco, and I'll be your host for today. I am the Student Programs Coordinator here at AGU. First off, just a few housekeeping items. If you have a question during the presentation, please type it into the question box in the right side control panel, and we will answer as many as we can at the conclusion of the presentation. Additionally, Patricia will ask for you to reply to some poll questions as well as an open-ended question today. Please type your response into the open-ended question into the question box on the right. We will also ask you to use the hand-raising feature to respond to one of Patricia's questions during the webinar, which is located on the right side control panel as well. And finally, the link to the online recording of this webinar will be sent to all webinar attendees in a follow-up email within the next few days. Presenting today's webinar is Patricia Simpson. Patricia is the owner and consultant of Game Changing Etiquette. Patricia is also the Director of Academic Advising and Career Services for the School of Chemical Sciences at the University of Illinois. She has worked in higher education for over 20 years and has been presenting etiquette dinners and workshops to corporations, universities, and civic groups for nearly 15 years. Today, she will discuss the intricacies of navigating professional etiquette. Whether you are still a student, a recent graduate, or a working professional, your etiquette habits can play a big part in your career. Patricia will discuss how to use etiquette to make a positive impact on your career. Additionally, there are resources on professional guidelines available at ethics.agu.org and harassment@agu.org. The direct links will be included in the follow-up email along with a link to the webinar recording. And with that, I'll pass the mic over to you, Patricia, so take it away.
Thank you so much, Leslie. Hey, I'm all glad you're here joining us today, and I think we've got some interesting things to chat about. I want to start by asking a question. Have you ever noticed how some people just sort of stay with you, like good stay with you or bad stay with you? They leave that impression. That's called a first impression, and today one of the things we're going to talk about is how to make those first impressions positive. As an owner and consultant of Game Changing Etiquette, I really am passionate about helping my students put their best foot forward, whether they're interviewing or as a professional, and I really began incorporating that passion into my etiquette and coaching. And through that, I've actually found that there are many misconceptions about etiquette and what etiquette really is, which is one of the other things I'd like to share with you today. In addition to how to make those positive first impressions and how your communication is part of that, some ways that if you do make a negative first impression, you can overcome that through professional etiquette. I think a lot of people really think that etiquette is all about rules. Rules, rules, rules. It's a big long list of books of things that I need to try and remember. Ultimately, though, etiquette is just about treating other people with respect. And that comes back to how you present yourself. You know, if you treat other people with courtesy, it maybe doesn't matter quite as much which fork you choose to use at dinner. One other thing is, as we begin and go through the webinar, if you do run into any technical difficulties, Leslie mentioned we're going to use the chat box to post some questions and answers and chat a little bit. But you can also use that to click that help link if you've got some challenges. So the big question is, what is etiquette exactly? A lot of people think it's this big, long, white glove thing where cotillions and so forth. But like I said, it's ultimately about treating other people with respect. So when people say, does etiquette even matter? Is there an issue with that? Why would it matter? Ultimately, corporations are spending millions of dollars on advertising, on training, on making sure that their employees are presenting the company in a positive light. The challenge is that first impressions can be really difficult to overcome. So if you have that negative first impression, that's what people are going to remember. Now, to be fair, business etiquette rules do differ from etiquette rules in other types of settings. So some of the things you might have heard about, holding the door if you're on a date and you're the gentleman, of course, that isn't necessarily going to apply in a business setting. So today I'm focusing specifically on professional etiquette, business etiquette. And one of the reasons you really want to implement that etiquette and that courtesy and respect at work is because you actually can show your own weaknesses if you're not using that or you're not treating other people with respect. That comes back on you negatively. Now, some people will ask me, Patricia, I want to be myself. Can't I just be the way I am? And I would hope, yes, of course, you are your best self, but you are your best self and treating other people with respect and being courteous and having that consistent courteousness and that consistent professionalism really can sort of help you when things don't go well. Because sometimes you're going to have mistakes and things will sort of backfire on you. So if on a consistent basis you're presenting yourself professionally and you're treating other people and even yourself with respect, then that's what people are going to pay attention to. I love this quote by Mark Twain. He ultimately said that etiquette requires us to admire the human race. And that's really because I feel like etiquette is about that. It isn't about the rules, although there are rules, but it's much more about treating others with respect and as if we really admire the human race. So let's start by talking a little bit about first impressions. As you probably know, that first impression is that gut sort of reaction that you're going to make when you meet somebody. Impressions are actually made in two different stages. There's that automatic, immediate, almost subconscious even, response that you get, that impression that you get about someone. And then hopefully you're going to have a more thorough and thoughtful, still in that first impression, but at a second stage. Unfortunately, that second piece doesn't always come. There was an older study from back in 2005 done at Princeton by Alex Todoroff and Janine Willis that I really find fascinating. Basically, they had their researchers look at pictures of political candidates. Within a microsecond, they found that their research study participants were accurate at who was going to win 70% of the time. 70. And that's based on a microsecond first impression. So obviously, if that first impression and the way you're presenting yourself isn't positive, the problem is that that actually stays with you. Some people say that that first stage happens in 1/10 of 1 second, so it's pretty fast. Now, of course, it is possible to overcome negative first impressions, which is great news, but you have to work at it. And using etiquette and treating others with respect is the way to have that happen. Unfortunately, not all people are courteous. I'm sure you've all run into that. You really need to be above that in order to have that positive first impression. So just as an example, say you're a homeowner and another homeowner in the neighborhood is out walking the dog and you're looking out your front window. And sure enough, you see that dog going to the bathroom in your front yard. What's your first response really want to be? Most of us are probably going to be a little frustrated. But if the owner picks it up, it's all right. We're going to walk on. It's no problem. But what happens when the owner keeps walking? Maybe looks around a little bit, hopes nobody's noticing, and leaves that dog's treat in your front yard. Probably not you as a homeowner are not going to see that as a treat, right? Now, you may be tempted to go out and say something to the dog owner or find out where he lives and return the treat to his house. But I'm going to tell you, you really want to be above all that. So ultimately, yes, being yourself is about being your best self. One of the things I really love is AGU's responsibilities and rights of scientists, because they're in that document, it's talking about excellence, and of course excellence is research, but excellence in research conduct, and that's what this is about, right? That's what etiquette helps you to do, is to be excellent, to adhere to ethics and integrity, to be a person who is consistent and demonstrates consistent behavior is being a person of integrity. And of course it means it's being respectful of all people, whether you agree or have differences of opinion or not. So that's what we're really going to want to focus on today. Now that first impression is what we've been talking about, so I'm going to start with a poll question that will just kind of see what y'all think out there. So we're going to switch over to our first poll question. How many positive interactions do people say, or do you say, that it takes to change that negative first impression? So you've got a couple different options out there, 3, 8, 10, 15, or it's impossible. So go ahead and take a couple seconds, and we'll close that in just a few seconds here.
All right, make your final selection. We're going to close out the poll in 3, 2, 1. All right, so it looks like 18% of respondents think that it takes 3 times to overcome a negative first impression, and 21% think it's 8. 43%, the highest percentage, think it takes 10 positive interactions to overcome a bad first impression, and 11% think 15, and 7% thinks it's impossible. You can't overcome a bad first impression.
Great, thanks, Leslie. Well, I'm actually encouraged to know that most of you think there is hope, which is great. Harvard did a study that's been reported in Forbes, and their magic number that they came up with was 8. So for those of you who said 8, that's, according to Harvard's study, that's the right question, or the right answer. So here's some ways to do that. Number 1, how you present yourself through your attire. Easy, that's going to be definitely part of that first impression. So you certainly don't want your attire to speak more loudly than your words. And that could be either direction, to be honest. Going too casual or going too formal demonstrates you're not really aware of your environment and what the culture is and what's expected. Dressing professionally definitely demonstrates respect. You can probably see this background image on my slide here. It's the same gentleman in every single one of those pictures, but you get a really different picture and impression of what he's like based on the different outfits. Now, some people have told me, hey, the first guy in the tux, he looks too stuffy for me to hang out with. Depending on your environment, that certainly may be the case, that he's overdressing. But it's important to, again, like I said, to make sure you're finding out in advance what the dress code is and to dress according to that. In many ways, we talk about attire in labs and why it's important to, for example, not have bare skin. That could be a cause for a really bad accident in certain situations, depending on what you're working with. But professional attire ultimately is even more than safety. You want to minimize bare skin for the same different reasons, but it's also something you want to do when you're in professional settings. It doesn't create that impression that you would want it to. So in one case, it's about safety, and in other cases, it's just about being professional. In addition, details really matter. So if you're wearing dark trousers and dark shoes, you want to make sure you've got those dark socks as well. Otherwise, it looks like you aren't completely put together. Because we're talking about first impressions, if you're not completely put together, suddenly that person who's making a judgment call about you may also think you're not very intelligent or you're not very organized. Could be completely inaccurate and unfair first impressions, just a point that your professional attire and details really can influence that. The final piece about attire is smells. And that's obviously something that's going to create a negative first impression. Smells aren't always bad, though. I mean, we think of the automatic bad smells, cigarette smoke or perhaps body odor, but there are also bad, good smells as well. So if you wear too much perfume or cologne, or you've used a really scenty lotion, that could actually aggravate someone's allergies, and now all they're thinking about is not sneezing. They're not thinking about making a good connection with you. So it's really important that the way you present yourself through your attire is professional as well. One of the very first things that you typically do when you meet a new person is you greet them, right? So one of the things that's a crucial piece of that is that handshake. If you've never gone out and actually shaken hands with somebody and asked them for an honest feedback of what that handshake was like, I would really encourage you to do that today. It might take somebody off guard, so you might want to find somebody you really trust. But say, hey, how was my handshake? Because that tends to be such an important part of that initial greeting in American culture. If you have one of those limp fish handshakes or a knuckle breaker that makes your fingers hurt after you've shaken hands with somebody, even those political things where people use like 2 hands and pat you on the forearm, very patronizing, by the way, any of those are going to create a negative first impression. So find out what your handshake is. What message are you sending? Practice your handshake and ask somebody to give you some feedback. Along with that handshake, when you're meeting someone, if you're sitting down, you want to make sure you stand up. That gives you a full, hey, I'm present, and I'm interested that you're here, and I want to really truly meet you. Make sure you're making good eye contact, And even if you're not normally a smiler, smile when you meet someone new. That shows that you're engaged and that you really care about that person that you just met. Now you want to know how to make proper introductions if you are now the introducer between two other people, and sometimes that can be a little bit difficult. The good news, though, is that there's one easy little tip. You don't need a lot of fancy words when you're introducing people. All you need are this and is. So if you're introducing people, you would say the first person's name, this is, and then the second person's name. You don't need to say, oh, I'd like to introduce you to, or I'd like to have you make the acquaintance. None of that is necessary. This and is are all you need. Now the other challenge is knowing whose name to say first. And there's a really easy rule. Whoever has the most importance role between the two, or age, or whatever the case may be. So the more important person's name is said first, this is, and then the other person's name. So in business, that most important person we generally look at based on title. So if you're introducing the CEO of your organization to a work colleague, then the CEO would be more important. But say it gets a little trickier because you've got two people who are both the same level. At that point, you would then defer to age or length of time at the organization. So if the person is older, then they would be more important. Or if they've been at the company for 10 years versus somebody who's just started, the person who's been there for 10 years would be more important. Sometimes it gets even a little bit blurrier than that. And in those cases, you don't want to ask somebody like, well, how old are you? If you can't tell, don't ask. However, just in those cases, pick somebody. Whoever you want to put first is fine. The one exception to the title rule is if you're introducing somebody to a customer or a client. You've probably heard the old saying that the customer is always right. In this case, the customer is always most important. So even if you're introducing a customer to the CEO of your company, you would want to say the customer's name first, this is, and then the CEO's name. The other piece is, how do you do the closing? So say you're at a networking event and you've been talking to somebody for a long time. I would encourage you to sort of write up and memorize that closing line before you ever even attend the event. One of my favorites, and please don't tell anybody, but one of my favorites is to make the person that I'm talking to feel like I'm doing them a favor. So what I'll say is something along the lines of, I'm sure you have a lot of people that you really want to meet today, so I don't want to monopolize your time. But it's been really nice meeting you, and I look forward to staying in touch. And then I kind of walk off. So that makes it seem like I'm doing them a favor, when in reality, I want to go on and talk to other people. But like I said, don't tell anybody my secrets, right? So both that introduction and that closing are going to make you feel a lot more confident when you're meeting new people, but they also help you to give another person respect. Another way to give people respect is to pay attention to what they're doing and what they're saying. I think that can be challenging when you're in a conversation, because we tend to want to think like, what's the next thing I should be saying, or how should I be responding to that? And as a result, we kind of get in our own heads, and we're not reflecting on what they're saying, and we're not in the moment. So it's really important to be in the moment, focused on what that other person is saying. Along those same lines, how many times have you forgotten somebody's name? In fact, let's do that right now. Let's go to your chat box, and there's a raise your hand feature. So if you yourself have ever forgotten somebody's name, go ahead and raise your hand, and we can all see that. Hopefully all of us have. Are admitting to it.
Bonnie, Cecilia, Aaron, Isaac, Jeremy, Jessica, Kate, tons of people are raising their hand. There's a lot of people here today that have forgotten someone's name at one point.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate y'all's honesty, because I think that's probably pretty rare for somebody to never have forgotten the name. So what do you do? If you've forgotten somebody's name, I would just say, go ahead and ask again. Now, the key here is the second time you ask, you really want to focus in on what they're saying and try and remember that name. But it's better to ask again than to walk around not remembering that person's name. Because what happens if somebody else comes up and now you're in a position where you're trying to introduce somebody and you can't remember their name? I've heard of many couples or groups of friends who will have a little signal with each other if they've forgotten somebody's name, so that person can, you know, wink their eye or whatever, and that additional partner will come in and say, hey, I am, and introduce themselves, so that way that person's focused on saying their name again. That is a good trick. But I think most people would rather have you say, I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name. Could you tell me again? Rather than you calling them the wrong name or just not ever referring to them by name. In fact, in many cases, when you say that, they'll say, you know what, I'm the same thing, I don't remember your name either. So then you can go through that again. Like I said, once you've asked for that name, you want to try to remember it after that second time, if at all possible. Also, I think it's really important in professional settings to truly learn how to mix and mingle, how to network. One of the key pieces of that is to be positive when you're meeting new people. You never know who knows whom or who works where until you've actually talked to them a while. So you could be in danger of, if you're whining and complaining, saying something negative that could come back and not just create a negative first impression, but a negative lasting impression about you. I had an employer one time talk to me about one of my students who was actually looking for a job. And he came up to that employer and started complaining or sort of saying negative things about that employer's competitor, which the student thought, oh, I'm going to win myself over by saying bad things about their competitor. But actually the employer said, I just looked at that student as negative in general, not that it was a good thing that he was saying bad things about my competitor. So the more positive you can be, the better. Now certainly we all need our areas that we need to vent and just be frustrated, but do that in a safe space. You know, do that with a really close friend, maybe even somebody who doesn't work with you, because the more you, even if you've got close friends at work, then that starts to create a negative morale around the organization. So find a friend, find a significant other that you can vent to in a safe place. All right, so if you're going to mingle and network, I mentioned that. There's a couple of quick tips just to keep in mind that'll make that process a little bit easier. One is go in with an agenda. If you've got a purpose for being there, maybe I want to meet 3 new people. That's your purpose. It gives you a little bit more confidence. The other thing is look for people who are standing by themselves, because chances are good that person is really going to welcome someone coming up and talking to them. So they're going to be more open to talking with you. So there are a couple of little quick tips, and if you've got questions about that, we can certainly talk more about that at the end. When you're in that networking situation, you always want to keep your name tag on your right shoulder. And you will go to an event and you'll see tons of people with name tags on the left, name tags on the right, name tags on their hips. The main reason you want it on that right shoulder is because if you're shaking hands properly, where you're squarely facing one another, making eye contact, your eyes naturally go up that arm to that right shoulder. And so it makes it a lot easier to just quickly look there to see what that person's name is. If there aren't sort of guidelines as far as what to put on your name tag and you're actually making your name tag yourself, just make sure you use your best handwriting so that it's legible, and always put your full name. Unless it's a more casual thing, then hopefully people would say, go ahead and use your first name only. So name tags on that right shoulder, so now you know, right? And always, again, make sure you're listening more than you're speaking, just because people really want you to stay and be engaged. All right, so let's talk just a little bit more about that networking process. I mentioned approaching people who are standing alone. I think that's a great way. Usually they're going to be really open to talking with someone if they get approached. The other thing is watching for body language. If somebody is talking to another person and their bodies are squarely facing each other, then it probably is going to be a signal to you that it's going to be harder to break into that conversation. So you can see in the background picture here, the people on your right, on the right side of your screen, they're talking to each other, but they both have pretty open body language. Their feet are open. They're not squarely facing one another, so it was easier for that woman in the middle to come over and talk to them if she, for example, had been off by herself. So look for that open body language. When you do approach someone, the very first thing you want to do is introduce yourself. Again, extend that hand. You've hopefully now got a super strong, positive handshake. Smile, make eye contact, state your name. Once you start talking, a great way to win people over is to express empathy and to give compliments. Now, you don't want them to sound sugary and overly done. You want them to be genuine. Empathy is pretty easy if somebody starts talking about their job. If you ask somebody, for example, what they do for a living, and if they start talking about it a little bit and you say something along the lines of, wow, that sounds really challenging, instantly you have a best friend, somebody who's commiserating with me. Wow, this is great. So that's a really good sort of phrase that you can use all the time to be able to express empathy but not sound sickeningly sweet, right? You also want to make sure that you're always asking open-ended questions. Now, of course, you want to steer away from hot topic issues. Right now, politics, religion, anything along those lines, and really talk about things that are easy and less threatening and so forth. But keep open-ended questions. Instead of, did you have a good day, talk about what happened today, for example. When you're mixing and mingling, if you have food at that type of an event, it's a really great idea to keep your plates and glasses no more than half full. Because what tends to happen is you've got your glass in one hand, you've got a plate in another hand, and now someone comes up and wants to shake hands. You don't have anything left to give. So if you keep your glass half full, it's going to be less apt to spill. And if you keep your plate half full, you can actually balance that glass on the clean part of your plate and hold all of that with your left hand. Now you've got that second right hand to be able to shake hands, or if need be, even to eat your food or take a drink of your glass. So that's a really great tip, no matter when you're at a mix and mingle type of event, whether it's work or for fun, either way. The last thing that's really crucial, especially when you're at work events, is to always follow up after the event. So if you meet someone that's interesting, sometimes you'll get a business card, sometimes you won't. It sort of depends on the situation and whether people even have brought business cards. But LinkedIn or other types of social media are great places to be able to follow up with people, to connect with people. So that's actually a question I was curious about. So if you have ever yourself followed up with someone after a networking event where it was just a great thing that you followed up and a great way that you did it, throw some thoughts into that chat window for us so that we can kind of share with one another and see, hey, this was a really good idea or a great way to follow up. Some of you maybe haven't done that or you haven't followed up after an event, but perhaps you've heard of someone else who did. So another success story that maybe somebody else had. Hey, I met so-and-so at an event, and I connected with them through Reddit or through LinkedIn, and this was the result. So even if it wasn't something you did, but maybe a story you've heard, go ahead and throw that in the chat window too.
So if you look on the right-hand side control panel, there's a question box. Just type it into there. In the meantime, I can think of something where at an annual meeting, someone actually followed up with me asking if they could post on their own social media for their organization something that we had discussed at that meeting, and we have since developed a professional relationship. And I thought that was a really great way for them to kind of introduce themselves again and create an entry point for us to create a relationship.
Yeah, how did that make you feel when they did that?
Great. That, you know, they remembered me, they thought what we had talked about was important, and they found use out of it.
Absolutely. Anybody else out there?
Nobody yet.
Oh, come on, you guys. I know you've had some great stories you've probably had happen.
Oh, a couple are just coming in. So Cecilia said after a guest lecture, she talked to the speaker and received her business card and set up plans to create a field trip to her office to follow her classmates and just see what was entailed in her job. That's really great. Also, really great. From Eric, he was actually able to find someone a job at his organization after interacting with them at a conference.
Good for you, Eric. All right, well, if you've got some more... Oh, yeah, if you've got other stories, go ahead and share them so that way we can have access to those and be able to read one another's comments. And again, If you've got other questions as we're talking, that's the same place you want to post those, that we can address those at the end. I'm going to talk a little bit more about telephone etiquette, but certainly keep on posting those stories. So telephone etiquette is something that I think we've gotten a little bit lazy about. Many times at phones, Leslie and I were actually even talking about a situation where you might be in a shared environment and trying to grab for your headsets and so forth. So phones, I think, have gotten a really different usage than maybe 10 years ago. Nonetheless, there are still some basic guidelines, I guess, that you really want to try to follow. One of the most important is to respond to any messages that you receive within 1 business day. That's important because that person wants to make sure that their voicemail was even received, for example. Now, if you are unable to get the information that they need, respond anyway and say, hey, I've got your call, I'm following up and trying to get some answers for you, and I'll call you back as soon as I can. That's sufficient. Now, what happens if you're out of the office? In the olden days, people actually had answering machines and so forth where they would change them anytime they left the office. And actually, that's a rule that still really applies. Honestly, even myself, I get pretty lazy with my voicemail system at work, and it's easy to, of course, update that automated message on my email, but I don't always think about my voicemail. Now, luckily for me, I actually get all of those messages transposed into an email message, so I can still follow up even if I'm not in the office and don't have access to that machine. So if you aren't going to be in the office, you either need to change your message or make sure that you're still following up via email or by phone with messages that do come in. If you are answering a telephone, and you really want to make sure that you're including your name and your organization name when you answer that phone, just so people are sure that they have the right number. Plus, that makes you sound a lot more professional than just answering with a hello. This is a caution, especially if you have an internal where everybody's numbers and names will pop up on your phone. But even if you're getting external calls, do not assume that caller ID is correct. Because what you might be inclined to do is, hey, Leslie, because Leslie's name pops up on your phone. But maybe Leslie's given her phone to somebody else to use, even if it's her cell phone, and now you sound awkward and unprofessional. So never assume that caller ID is correct. Just answer with your name and organization, even if it's your very best friend calling from the next cube over. If you are making phone calls, always introduce yourself first and state some basic business. You don't have to go into the full details, but some basic business, even if you know that the person that you are talking to is merely a gatekeeper. Because in many cases and at many places of employment, gatekeepers actually may be able to help you better than the person that you're trying to reach. So by sharing, here's who I am, here's why I'm calling, that gives that person an opportunity to either divert your call to a better person or to sometimes even just relay the information that you need to you directly. If by some chance you do need to leave a message, make sure you leave a full message. Include your phone number, include your name, and so forth. The chance of actually reaching someone that you're calling is only 1 in 6. So the reverse is true too. When they call you back, their chance of getting you is only 1 in 6. So you end up playing phone tag in some cases for a really long time. As a result, if you leave a full message, hey, here's why I'm calling, here's what I need help with, that actually will help you to get the information that you need. Cell phones are a little bit unique. I think, again, they've become a pretty common part of our culture. You want to still make sure that you're paying attention to both your ringtone and also your voice. For some reason, many people, not everybody, but talk more loudly when they're on a cell phone. So if you are in a situation where there are other people around, not everybody gets to hear your phone call. So pay attention to your voice volume as well. This next bullet is my absolute mission. So the more I can get the word out there on this, the better. If you are talking to someone on your cell phones and the call gets dropped, the person who originated the call is the one who calls back. Why is that important, you may ask? How many of you have tried to call somebody, a call gets dropped, and now you're both trying to call each other back, and you get each other's voicemails. That happens all the time. So the etiquette rule actually says that the person who originated the call is the one who calls back. And the reason it's my mission is that if everybody in the world knew that that was the real etiquette rule, then we would all be fine, and we would never run into each other's voicemails on this situation again, which I think would be a fabulous thing. You want to make sure that you, if you are using a phone, would not use a cell phone to do anything, talking, texting, data, if you would not be able to talk to your neighbor at full volume, which means in a business meeting, no phones. When you're at the theater, no phones. So any place where you wouldn't actually talk to your neighbor at full volume, you shouldn't use your phone. Of course, I think most people know not to use their phones to talk, but the texting and data rule is more because of that professional courtesy that I was talking about at the beginning. In fact, kind of a sad story, just last year I had a graduate student who was going out for an interview with a company, and one of the pieces of that interview was a dinner, as probably many of your organizations do as well. And during that dinner, the recruiter said, you know what, this is informal. I just want you to be able to ask the questions that you have. It's casual, relax, which is a lie, by the way. And so the student's like, okay, cool, it's informal. I'm going to, check in with my friends and make sure everything's good. He wasn't even on the phone for very long. But because he was on the phone at all, the recruiter said, this student is not interested in me or my company. He's not engaged. He's not present. He's on his phone. So I'm not going to make him an offer. I want somebody who's going to be interested, engaged, and excited about my company. So even though the student was only on the phone for a couple of minutes, that conveyed the impression that he wasn't treating them with respect, that he wasn't interested and excited. So that's why, unless you're in a situation where you can talk full volume, you're not with a person, you're not engaged, you're not present, that's the only time you really should use your cell phones. Along those same lines, if you're at a meeting or definitely at a meal, that cell phone should be away, in your pocket, in your lap, in a purse, in a briefcase, whatever the case might be. Never place it on the table. The only exception really to using a phone in a meeting is if somebody says, hey, does this date work? Or can you look up, such and such on your phone and tell me this information? So if you need to access your email in order to get engaged in the meeting, or if you need to access your calendar, then it's okay. But any other time, that phone should be not even on the table, but completely away and not part of that conversation. Like I said earlier, ultimately, overusing your phone, especially when you're in real time with other people, basically demonstrates not only a lack of respect for that other person, but even a lack of self-control or self-awareness. You're not sure how you're coming across. You're not aware of that. Email can be kind of hairy. I think we've gotten pretty lackadaisical in most of our email use because we use it so much for so many different things. So one of the key points I want you to walk away with and just remember today is that every single email has the chance of being forwarded, whether intentionally or unintentionally. So always be careful what you're writing. Now certainly that means not being angry and going off on somebody, but it can even mean something like being careful about using spell check, rereading your message, making sure that the message that you're sending is a correct one. Now I've seen a ton of people who use their phones or an iPad on a regular basis will put a sort of an automatic statement at the bottom, like, please excuse any typos or mistypings in this email, I'm using my phone. But to me, and to many people, ultimately that actually conveys a lack of professionalism, laziness, lack of care. In some cases, even a lack of intelligence, because I'm not sure if you're just lazy and not rereading your message, or if you really don't know how to put together a proper sentence. So it's important to always use spell check, reread your messages. You don't want to be the laughing stock because somebody has forwarded your typo to another person at the office. The other thing that you want to pay attention to is making sure that you're using the right medium. So I think we've gotten so used to using email that we use it for a lot of things that we probably shouldn't. So that can also probably apply to things like social media. So using Facebook when it's a professional interaction, you really should be using LinkedIn. In this case, though, using email perhaps instead of using instant messaging if you've got IM at your organization where you work. If you're just saying thanks, you probably don't need to just send me an email just to say the word thanks. You also want to make sure that you use a subject, a greeting, and a full message if you're using email. So if you're thinking, I don't want to include those things, then maybe use a different medium. Pick up the phone or walk to someone's workspace or, again, use an IM. But if you're using email, you need to make sure you're using that subject line so the person knows if this is something I need to prioritize immediately or I can come back to later. Still use a proper greeting, at least on that initial email, and write out a full message. Don't use text speak when you're actually sending an email. However, that being said, you want to keep your messages somewhat short. If it's something where you basically are writing a 5-page docket, you probably want to find something else other than email, another way to convey that information, maybe getting together a meeting or getting together in person. Bullets are also really helpful because, again, if someone's looking at this on their phone, it makes it easier to scroll and find out what your main points are that you're trying to convey. This is something that doesn't come up a lot, but I have gotten actually quite a few questions about it recently, so I wanted to include it. Sometimes, for whatever reason, someone will need to know that you've actually read their email. So they'll include a message notification request. And in many email systems, you have the opportunity to click, yes, I've read this, or ignore. If someone has sent you a message notification request, don't just ignore that, because there's obviously some type of reason that they need to know that you've read that. So go ahead and check, yes, I've read this, and then respond to that person, again, within 1 business day, just like you would with a phone call. And then final bullet on this section is just make sure you're always following your employer's guidelines regarding email usage, regarding social media at work. A lot of people feel like, hey, this is my Facebook account, so I'm going to put whatever I want. But when you are at work, your time and, of course, the technology that you're using are the property of your boss. So it's important that you are still following whatever guidelines it is that they want to put together. So we've talked about a lot of different random areas and etiquette and so forth. So I'm just curious, based on email, to know what your pet peeve is. So that's our second poll question. So what is your biggest email pet peeve? Is it using those all caps when you get a message that sounds like somebody's yelling at you? Or the incorrect spelling or grammar that I mentioned earlier? Really exceedingly overly long email messages? Someone who doesn't use a subject line, so you're not sure whether or not it's a priority? Or just threw another one in there, like receiving late emails that you're sort of expected to respond to. So go ahead and throw out there what you think your greatest pet peeve is.
All right, make your selection. We're going to close out the poll in 3, 2, 1. All right, well, it's a dead tie between incorrect spelling or grammar and overly long messages. The next highest one is no or inappropriate subject line. And then the least pet peeve is all caps or receiving late night or off-hour emails.
Well, that's good. I guess work never ends, right, for y'all? All right, so I'm going to talk briefly about appreciation and thank you notes and why that's important. Ultimately, one of the things that I think is funny is being someone who has professional etiquette or presents themselves professionally ultimately may just mean putting up with other people's bad manners. One of the things where I think we've really, really slipped in our culture is expressing appreciation. And so we've got to talk about that today. Generally, that's going to mean writing thank you notes. Not in every case. Sometimes it's just saying a simple thank you if someone's done something for you. But a lot of times we forget that, or we think, oh, that's just their job, so why do I have to thank them? But it's really important just to express that appreciation. Now, if it is something where you need to write a note, ultimately, it's always better to send one late than to never send one. But there's a couple of tips and rules for different favors and how to express appreciation. So if you have an interview, because again, I work with students who are interviewing all the time, The general rule is actually 24 hours. So within 24 hours, you want to send that thank you note. And email in this case is perfectly acceptable. In fact, it's encouraged because a lot of hiring decisions get made pretty quickly. So if you have an interview, you really want to make sure you send an individualized thank you note to each interviewer within 24 hours. If someone does a special favor for you, I mentioned earlier, just go ahead and say thank you. But if it's something kind of above and beyond, they maybe put in some extra effort, and you really want to recognize them for that. Depending on the situation, sometimes that can also be email. Sometimes it might be getting out a note card and writing a personalized handwritten note. But generally, those types of thank yous should come within 1 week. That might also be for like a recommendation letter. If someone writes you a recommendation letter, I think Eric had mentioned, you know, he helped somebody get him a job. I hope you got a thank you note for that, Eric. But if you didn't, you should have within 1 week. And then the final piece would be gifts. So if someone actually gives you a gift for a party or a retirement or going away or just a gift because, the general rule for that is 2 weeks. With one exception, if it's like a wedding or a baby gift, they kind of expect you're going to need a little bit more time. So in that case, they usually say 6 weeks up to 3 months. Now again, no matter what, better or late is always better than never. So go ahead and send those thank you notes if you feel like, you know what, I feel convicted. There's something I probably should have sent a note for. Don't delay. Go out and do it after this webinar is over. So what happens if something does go wrong? Because that happens in every case. No matter how much of a professional, hey, even a certified etiquette trainer makes mistakes sometimes. So how do you handle if you make a mistake? If you completely space out a meeting or your another meeting runs late, you're not able to make it, you want to make sure that you say, I'm sorry. Ultimately, remember that you're only human. And it's not only about what you do, but it's also about how you react after. So certainly if you make a negative first impression and you have enough consistent, constant, positive interactions after that, they're going to change a little bit how they remember you. Now that first impression may always be in the back of their mind, but hopefully they'll look at you as more of a positive person as opposed to that negative thing that happens. So an apology can go a long way. However, I would recommend you don't overdo it. So I had a situation here on campus that happened that I heard about where one of my students was in a class. The professor had kind of told them, hey, I don't want phones going off in the class. Please don't have your phones out. And she swore up and down, left and right, that her phone was on silent. But for some reason, that day, it went off. Because she was really embarrassed, she, of course, quickly grabbed it, shut it off really quickly, but she felt like I probably need to do a little bit more than that. So she said, she apologized in front of the class and kind of said, oh, I'm so sorry, in addition to just quickly shutting that phone off. That probably would have been okay if she would have stopped there, but she didn't. After the class, she went up to the professor and apologized about 5 minutes worth of, I'm so sorry, it'll never happen again. The professor's like, it's okay, it's fine. So then she got back to her residence hall room and she sent an email, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean for my phone. So it kind of got a little overdone, and although I know she really genuinely felt bad, all the professor really talked about was how much she apologized as opposed to the phone going off. Had she just said, I'm sorry once, he might not have even remembered it. And mind you, this was about a month later that I heard this story. So he remembered the phone going off because she kind of overdid the apologies. I think the nice thing is that people do desire to be fair, and so those repeated small interactions, as I mentioned before, can build trust the fastest. So ultimately, don't get so stressed out about every little rule that you sacrifice having a good interaction. Don't overdo the apologies, which is our last poll question for today. So how have you handled your phone going off in an inopportune time? Have you maybe just ignored it and let it ring and hoped nobody heard it? Did you shut it off quickly and apologize once? Did you covertly shut it off and pretend it wasn't yours? Or did you actually walk out of the room to answer that call? So go ahead and say how you handled that. Now let Lizzie take it from here.
All right, if you guys could make your selection. And we'll keep the poll open for another 3, 2, and 1. All right, so it looks like 88% took note of your story and said shut it off quickly and apologize. And 12%, however, said that they covertly shut it off and pretended that it was not theirs.
I love the honesty. That's great. Well, so good. So apologize once, let it go from there. Ultimately, etiquette is about treating other people with respect. So it really does cross all boundaries because respect is obviously something that we all desire. That being said, when you are in different cultures or in different types of organizations, sometimes you want to make sure that you are following the customs and etiquette rules, if you will, of that particular country or organization. And so I love this book that's up here, Kiss, Bow, or Shake Hands by Terry Morrison. Especially if you do a lot of international work or international traveling, I feel like this is a must-have. It really helps give some basics. These other 2 resources are also helpful. Panache That Pays by Maria Everding and this Culture and Manners Institute. You can actually sign up to get a tip every single week sent to your email inbox. So it's kind of fun just to hear issues that are coming up and different things. In addition to that, of course, there are tons of online resources that are available. There are groups on LinkedIn. You've got a lot of different resources that are out there and available to you. So I encourage you to continue the conversation. Ultimately, remember that etiquette is about respect and treating other people with respect. And if you've got that respect, like I said, it doesn't matter which fork you use. So I'd love to hear your questions. If you've got any that you want to throw out there that we can still address in the last couple minutes that we've got today.
Thank you, Patricia, for a really engaging and informative presentation. We already have a couple questions, actually, in the questions box. If any of you guys have any others, definitely type those in. So first, let's start off with Yizing. I followed up with people after events, but it was usually a one-time thing, whether through email or LinkedIn, without further connection in the future. So what's a better way to do a follow-up?
Well, that's a really great question. I wanted to turn on my webinar so you could all see me today. And I think what's really important is using that LinkedIn like you did. I mean, that's definitely a starting point. If somebody chooses not to follow up or not to agree to connect with you on LinkedIn, for example, sometimes that means that that's just a connection that's not going to go any further. And proper etiquette actually says letting people have that choice is important too. So I know sometimes it's somebody you really want to stay in touch with, but sometimes you just kind of have to let that relationship go. Now, you certainly can if you've got a business card and maybe they haven't responded on LinkedIn. Sometimes people just aren't on LinkedIn. Then go ahead and send a direct email. But if that doesn't really work, like I said, just sometimes you have to let that relationship just go.
Great. And this is actually 2 questions from the audience.
Good.
So what do you do if someone, especially someone in a higher authority position, repeatedly calls you by the wrong name? How do you correct them?
Unfortunately, that happens to me a lot. I go by Patricia, and sometimes people will call me Pat. And if my husband is ever around, he absolutely hates that. But that being said, if someone is actually higher than you, I would enlist sort of a help so that you're not the one who has to go to them and say, hey, my name is really Patricia. So, for example, if they have an assistant that you could sort of befriend, then that assistant is probably the best person to say, actually, I think she really prefers going by, or her name actually is. Now, unfortunately, some people aren't listening to my etiquette webinars that I'm doing or just aren't paying attention to that, and they may still call you by the wrong name. Just kind of, sometimes etiquette means taking the higher road and being a bigger person than they are. So enlist an assistant or enlist a friend or a helper, but if that doesn't work, then just smile and nod.
That is definitely a question close to my heart. I've had that happen before too. And I think that's a great idea to have their assistant step in. Another question we have from Cecilia. If maybe during a networking event you extend your hand for a handshake and the other person doesn't take it, how would you play that off?
I would say just at that point, just drop your hand. Hold it. Don't like immediately pull it away, but hold it out there for a second or two. You feel kind of awkward, but if they don't take your hand, it might be a religious reason. It might be they might have just not seen you. They might have a cold. Sometimes people aren't sure how to handle those situations. So if you have extended your hand, it's out there for a second or two, and the other person doesn't take it, just go ahead and let it drop and say, it's very nice to meet you, and then kind of continue on with the conversation. You have to sort of muster back your confidence, because sometimes that feels really awkward for you, but just pull that back together. And like I said, it could be a religious reason or something that people have chosen not to take your hand.
And this next one is related from Carolyn. What if someone's hands are sweaty? Is there a solution on how to handle this when you're shaking their hand?
No. Now, the person whose hands are sweaty hopefully is self-aware enough that they can take care of that beforehand. A good way is to kind of keep your hand in a pocket. Now, you don't want to like wipe it on your leg before you extend your hand to shake hands, but if you keep your hand in your pocket, sometimes that can help with that. And I've had friends, I actually had a friend who had really sweaty hands all the time, and she used to take dry deodorant and like a stick solid and rub it on her hands and rub it in really well before she would go out to networking events. And that helped her a lot. So if you're the one with the sweaty hands, that's sort of a tip. If not, then I would say go ahead and shake the hand, pretend like it's not sweaty, but certainly stick it in your pocket so you can kind of wipe it off without making it really obvious. And then as soon as you have a chance, head for that hand sanitizer, because that's kind of gross.
All right, the next question we have from Jeremy. It's about emails and how to format them. And he said in his organization, it seems common for them to have a brief greeting, get to the point right after, and then below paragraphs explaining the background if needed. Does this come off as rude?
So actually, I think that's probably a pretty good way to follow. So you've got a greeting, you're not completely ignoring the person, and then you're not giving too much information right off the bat. So it's sort of like an abstract on a paper. So they can look at that abstract and then look for additional details if they need to. So no, that's actually a great method. Now, one question though that you probably, I didn't hear asked, but that is relevant to that is you do want to follow the customs to some extent that are happening within your culture. So just like dress, you want to be aware enough of the environment that you're in. Just as an example, I had a friend who would always ask me if I was mad when I sent emails. And when I went back and read his emails, I realized that he usually put a paragraph, even though this was work related, of, hey, how are you? I hope you're having a good day. So I started responding the same way, putting more information, just chit-chatty at the front, and then going into my business, and that changed our whole relationship. So sometimes you have to modify and adapt a little bit for your culture, or for, in this case, a particular customer that I worked with.
All right, so we have time for one final question, I think, and this is from Eric. When is the proper time in a first interaction to hand someone your business card?
Great question, Eric. So it kind of depends on the situation. If you are talking with someone who's significantly higher in status or like title than you are, you have to wait for that higher person to give a business card. So you wouldn't actually, if you're the lower titled person, give your business card. So vice versa, if you're the higher status person, usually as you are, or equals, usually as you're wrapping up the conversation would be the most common place. So thank you, it's been really nice meeting you, and you would hand that business card. The other time that might come up, and you sort of have to play it by ear, is if someone says, hey, could I follow up with you about such and such, or could I check in with you about this question? Then at that point, even if you're still talking, you could procure that or proffer that business card at that point. So title is important. If you're equals or you're the higher person, then it's okay to give the business card. Otherwise, you would wait for the more senior person. Otherwise, at the end of the conversation, unless it makes sense earlier in the conversation, if somebody asks, could I follow up with you? Great.
Well, we're just about to wrap up, and if you had a question that wasn't answered, we'll try and follow up with you individually afterward. But with that, Patricia, it's been a really great webinar. Thank you for taking the time to speak and share knowledge with us today. And thank you all in the audience for joining us for today's presentation. Keep your eye out for a follow-up email. It will have links to the webinar recording and also additional resources. Thank you all and have a wonderful day.
Great, my pleasure. Thanks, everybody.